photo taken of a computer screen that had a photo displayed on it, and that under those conditions, it's not clear that the algorithms used to try to identify AI-generated imagery could even make a determination. And so one last item I'll put up in the front of the nest. I just wanted to note that it looks like Twitter has been interfering a little bit with accounts that like to cover Ukrainian developments. This was a tweet from the Georgian Legion, but I saw many other people in these spaces who noted they appeared to have search suggestion bans applied to their accounts, which means that if you don't follow a person and you go to search for their name in the Twitter search, their account will not come up. And likewise, if they are running a space, you can't find them in the spaces search, and their essentially reach is constrained in some other ways. This is concerning all on its own. I happen to be one of the accounts, like I think there were hundreds and hundreds, but I happen to be one of the accounts that had this applied to my account. And so our numbers tonight, for example, might be a little bit smaller because people might not be able to find it, the space, as in if they're searching my name, it just may not come up because of these bans that are applied. And it's, no word from Twitter on whether this is a policy to try to downrank conversation about Ukraine. But you may want to check if you've been affected, and if this frustrates you, then reach out to Twitter. Make your opinion known. I'm not particularly happy about it, and just to note that one way to counter that is to promote work on Ukraine. So if you see it because you follow a person, don't assume that those tweets are being promoted to a wide audience anymore, and that it may be up to you, if it's good quality work, to retweet it or amplify it so that it can go to people who follow you, but who may not follow the original creator of the work. Okay, and I'll just note, maybe what I'll do is, without running through it, I will just move up to the front of the nest so it's a little bit easier to see. I generated a tweet I call the Ukraine overview, and it contains links to some of the better mappers. In this case, I included the Institute for the Study of War, War Mapper, the Ukraine Control Map put together by Project Owl, and Andrew Perpetua's map. And that those maps may become relevant a little bit later on when we get to updates on Ukraine. But I've been going on long enough, and we have been joined by a guest tonight, Sam Bendet. Sam wears a couple of different hats, and I think in particular for our purposes tonight, he works with the Center for Naval Analysis, where he looks at the use of drones in military applications and the use of artificial intelligence. And he's one of the foremost experts on those matters here on Twitter. So you have probably seen his great work before. He has come to speak with us, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, where we chatted about crowdsourcing efforts in Russia, ways to for the Russian forces to get drones from sort of volunteer fundraisers, because the Ministry of Defense just wasn't getting enough to the front. And that was an insightful talk. So I'm excited to chat with Sam tonight. And our chat tonight, let me just make sure I get it, to the front of the nest, so you can see his resources. So the thing that inspires the conversation tonight is a report that Sam put out called Russia's Use of Uncrewed Systems, and it should appear in the front of the nest in just a moment. And we'll use that as a launching point, but then because this report covers up to sort of early this year, hopefully we can get some updates on some of the latest developments. So Sam, thank you very much for joining us.
It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
So I thought maybe we could start, Sam. We didn't discuss it in detail when you were with us before, but could you explain what the Center for Naval Analysis does, and when you generate these sorts of reports, who are you hoping to aim them at, and who are you hoping to inform?
Of course, CNA, Center for Naval Analysis, is what is called an FFRDC, or Federally Funded Research and Development Center. We are an organization that is mostly funded from the Department of Defense. In our case, it's the Department of Navy. That is, a significant share of our operational budget comes from the Department of Navy, and all the research funded by that chunk of money goes back to the Department of Navy, its various offices, under different types of classification. And so I joined CNA in 2016 when Michael Kaufman, the current director of the Russia Studies program, was standing up the Russia program. And so I've been at CNA since 2016. Our reports are often funded either by specific Department of Defense offices or others in the U.S. government interested in a specific aspect of Russian military security and defense research. The report in question that we're going to discuss was actually funded by the U.S. European Command and their Russia Studies Institute. And U.S. EUCOM actually funds a lot of our research, which is then made public. The research we do is obviously at the behest of the Department of Defense and specific offices, but it is also meant to educate a much broader share of the U.S. government, as well as the general policy community, on a specific aspect of what Russian military is and what it does.
And so I read through the report when you first released it a little over a week ago, and then I refreshed myself today. And, having followed a lot of the, your work in particular here on Twitter for essentially the duration of the war, I thought it was a great comprehensive overview of these matters, and that there were lots of details in there, even for people who have followed it closely, all the way down to some Russian commercial drone operating instructions, or I particularly liked that you had the tables setting out the drones that Russia has total versus those that have been seen in Ukraine, because there were a few that I wasn't even familiar with. And so I appreciated the level of detail. So in reading the report, it sounds like Russia felt like they were doing a good job at integrating drones into their strategy of reconnaissance strike or reconnaissance fire, because they were using them fairly heavily in the initial invasion of Ukraine and in Syria. But it seemed like once the fighting really broke out in Ukraine, they just weren't ready in the way that they thought they were. Right. So maybe just from the report, could you set out where you think they sort of had fooled themselves into having greater capability than they did?
Sure. I just want to set sort of the backdrop to the report itself. Me and my colleague, Jeff Edmonds, he's now at the Department of Defense and unfortunately cannot join the Twitter Spaces this time. We were looking at public sources. Earlier this evening, you mentioned Telegram, and you mentioned various tools to scour social media, and especially Telegram, for specific information. We actually highlight Telegram as one of our major sources for the report, because there's so much information now available on that social media platform and across its so many channels. There are Telegram channels which are led by soldiers, volunteers, by government officials, by a lot of participants in the war, and they post videos, they post imagery, they hold discussions. So Telegram really is very a data-rich source for the type of research that we would like to do, especially when it comes to what the Russians themselves are thinking and saying about their military conduct and military operations, and especially about the use of drones. And so reconnaissance fire and reconnaissance strike contours is a Russian concept where unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, and aerial drones are basically the eyes and ears of a military operation. They identify target, they transmit data in real time, and then they guide various assets such as land-based long-range artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, mortar units, and other units to target. And in Syria, these contours were actually quite successful, because in Syria, the Russian military did not face a sophisticated military. The anti-Assad forces did not have sophisticated military capabilities, didn't have sophisticated countermeasures, didn't have sophisticated electronic warfare. And in Syria, basically, it was a free-for-all for the Russian military. It had dozens of drones in the air at any given point, and these drones were providing data and information back to the Russian assets that basically conducted carpet bombing of a specific targeted area. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it did not anticipate a prolonged conflict which would turn into tactical level attritional warfare. It did not anticipate Ukrainian military basically putting up such amazing resistance and such powerful resistance and such sophisticated resistance to the Russian military operations. When they invaded, they didn't really feature a lot of UAVs in the initial stages. One of my first Twitter threads on this topic is, where are the Russian drones? And this is about 2 weeks in, because I did not see any evidence of Russian ISR UAV capabilities in Ukraine. Once it became clear to the Russians that they're in it for the long haul, and this is going to be a very long tactical slog, they then, of course, re-upped their drone force and put a lot of UAVs in the air. But again, they did not anticipate that this conflict would basically become a trench warfare World War II style conflict, where a lot of combat is happening at the tactical level at a range of less than 5 to 6 miles. And so Russian military, prior to the war in Ukraine, actually built up quite a substantial force of different types of ISR drones and a few combat drones. They boasted around 2,000 UAVs, making Russian drone fleet one of the largest operational fleets in the world. But they really didn't have a lot of tactical capabilities, despite the fact that Russian allies in the Donbass and Ukrainians themselves actually got very wise, very smart, very quickly back in 2014, 2015, to using commercial type short-range quadcopters and other types of short-range UAVs for tactical ISR and for tactical level combat. And so fast forward to 2023, fast forward to May of this year when we released our report, and both sides are now using a lot of tactical level drones, and I guess we can get to that in subsequent questions and in subsequent discussions tonight. But Russians may have been fooled by their success in Syria. They may have convinced themselves that Ukrainians are no better than the anti-Assad forces. And of course, that was a very erroneous conclusion. And a lot of these conclusions were influenced by political decisions, because intelligence reports were actually shaped by what the Russian president wanted to see and hear and read. And therefore, actionable data, truthful data probably was redacted. And so we find ourselves at this point in time with Russia scrambling to fill the ranks with tactical drones.
I've seen some writing in the last few weeks that make the argument that this isn't so much one drone war as several drone wars going on at the same time. And your report was helpful, I imagine, particularly for people who would be coming to the subject fresh, by outlining some of the evolving roles for the use of drones, whereas they were primarily used by Russia for ISR, as you mentioned a moment ago, which I believe is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, largely for artillery spotting and battle damage assessment. You mentioned the move to quadcopters, as increasingly important. But now we're seeing increasing use of FPV type drones that are essentially just guided munitions instead of the quadcopter bombers. We're now seeing some drone types that are acting as relay or for signals or as electronic warfare platforms. So it seems like there's been a real diversification of roles. Do you think that, given those changing roles, that Russia is getting the balance right in terms of its inventory of UAV systems? Because you mentioned, for example, that the Orlan 10 inventory may be getting quite low, sort of at the same time that they're bringing up their quadcopter reserves. Do you think that they saw a changing trend and they bought too strongly into one direction, or do you think they're diversifying well?
Well, our report actually covers that in different sections because we talk about Russian military-grade UAVs for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. We cover some of the military combat drones that Russia is using. The report then moves into a lengthy and detailed discussion of commercial drones. We discuss how Russian military acquires them, how it uses them. We provide translations of manuals created by volunteers on using such drones. There are, in fact, entire manuals written by volunteers for these type of operations. And then we talk about the use of Iranian drones as a gap filler for the Russian military. So again, going into the war in Ukraine, Russian military maintained a fairly large ISR drone fleet with ranges between 20 and 120 kilometers. It maintained a very small number of combat UAVs with a range of around 250 kilometers max. And it had no real tactical UAV capacity in the sense that it has them right now, even if they were a very few tactical quadcopters or some other small range, short range UAV in service. They were present in very small quantities. Again, the war in Ukraine has basically become a war where tactical advantage is key. And to have a tactical advantage, you need eyes and ears in the sky. And this is where a lot of smaller commercial drones come in. Why that is the case? Because throughout the conflict, you end up losing a very large number of drones. Russia's 2,000 plus fleet probably shrunk to a fraction of that, I would say 6 months in. And Russia was looking desperately for solutions to filling their gap. It didn't have enough combat UAVs that can fly high and far out of range of Ukrainian countermeasures and air defenses. It didn't have a lot of combat UAVs that it could field on its own, and it turned to partners and allies. And so the Iranian provided Shahed drone, which the Russian military is now building under its own name of Geran, which is a name for a flower that grows both in Russia and Iran. The Gerans provide a very key capability because these are expendable long-range combat drones. So what is needed in this war by both sides are a very large number of one-way, attritable, expendable UAVs. And this is where a lot of commercial UAVs come in because they don't survive longer than, I believe, a week or two. This is where a lot of FPV-type drones come in by the many thousands. These are racing drones or the first-person view drones, which require an operator to race them essentially through special goggles where an operator essentially becomes the drone as it flies. The advantage of FPV drones is that they can fly much faster than a regular quadcopter, and they can deliver a much larger warhead. And so Russian military filled its combat capability gap with attritable expendable drones. And it is now copying Ukrainian lessons and successes in buying a very large number of quadcopters to use for ISR combat targeting, as well as trying to build out a large number of FPV drones. I will cite our counterparts from RUSI, Royal United Services Institute, who recently published a report where they estimated that Ukraine alone loses up to 10,000 drones a month, different types of drones. Most of them are probably small commercial type drones. Why? Because a lot of these technologies aren't really built out with too many countermeasures in mind. Again, it's a simple commercial UAV isn't going to be battle hardened. And so countermeasures and electronic warfare on both sides are taking a heavy toll. And so what is necessary is a very large number of these drones, which essentially become surrogates for missiles and bullets. And I would say the losses on the Russian side are probably smaller than on the Ukrainian side because they have fewer of these quadcopters to begin with, but probably up to several thousand a month as well. And so as you can imagine, a military-grade drone force of 2,000 UAVs probably shrunk, again, to a fraction of that. A lot of ISR drones were lost to Ukrainian countermeasures, and therefore Russia switched to to several types of drones that could deliver a significant punch. I should also add that Russian military is also leaning heavily on one of its own loitering drones, the Lancet-3, which we describe in the report, which has a range of up to 40 to 50 kilometers, and which has become quite dangerous for a lot of Ukrainian artillery systems, which are very high on Russia's kill list.
Given that Russia wasn't prepared for it to become an attritional fight, including at the drone level, for example, in your report, you have some graphics that set out the kill chain and the way that drones are integrated into the broader system once they're in military use. But of course, there's an even broader context for the whole life cycle of a drone product, including, prototyping, getting the ministry to actually invest in it, drawing up procedures for operation and integration, then manufacturing at scale. Given that it should now be evident to the Russians that they need to emphasize mass production and innovation, do you think that they're doing that successfully? And if they're not, which aspects of that chain to development do you think is a hurdle for them?
I think we have to define what success means in this case. I think we should kind of frame our discussion as follows. Are we actually witnessing a moment in time when commercial technologies can be used at such scale alongside military technologies? And does that mean we're witnessing a long-term trend? Or is this a singular case where militaries grabbed for the available solutions to fill the gap because their respective military forces weren't quite ready for the type of warfare that the war in Ukraine has become? This is certainly true on the Russian side. Russian defense industrial sector can manufacture a range of UAVs, but these, as you yourself just indicated, have to go through testing and evaluation. The UAVs are more expensive. They're designed as multi-mission platforms, meaning they are supposed to fly for quite a long time, and therefore they have a much higher cost than any commercial type of drone. When it became clear to the Russians, because they saw what the Ukrainians were doing quite successfully, that they have to copy the Ukrainian tactics in buying thousands of DJI Chinese-made quadcopters, such as Mavics and Matrices, and again, use them as expendable items to gain an opportunity for a tactical advantage, just to see what's around the corner, what's above the house or just in the forest. Essentially, they went to, both sides went for online platforms like Alibaba and AliExpress and many others, where these DJI drones were sold. And they could buy that in very large quantities. On the Russian side, those purchases and acquisitions are actually made by volunteers. And we talked about that last time. There's an unprecedented level right now of organization and mobilization of society taking place in Russia, where multiple types of volunteer organizations can actually supply troops directly without MOD officially interfering. And so what is actually taking place right now is a Russian defense industrial sector, which again understands the problem, is slow to react to the fact that it has to manufacture cheap, attritable, completely expendable one-way systems. An FPV drone can be assembled for as little as $1,000, maybe a little more now as the parts are becoming less available because everybody's scrambling to get those parts. But $1,000, let's say $1,500 max, with an RPG warhead, can destroy an entire tank or an armored personnel carrier. Each of those military assets can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars. And so there's an understanding in the MOD that they need that. And several Russian defense industrial enterprises, such as Almaz-Antey and Kalashnikov, actually answered the call. They developed their own quote-unquote quadcopter. They are saying now that they will manufacture several thousand of them starting this summer. But it became very apparent very quickly that that manufacturing, that assembly itself depends on Chinese spare parts, because when Almaz-Antey unveiled its quadcopter called Dobrynya, we talk about that in the report, military bloggers, military commentators on Telegram were absolutely livid, because what they basically saw was a Chinese FPV racing drone with a Russian name on it. And Almaz-Antey had to issue an apology outlining that, yes, they in fact depend on Chinese components to a very large extent, but some of these components in the drone are Russian, and soon they will start replacing the Chinese components with the domestic manufacturer. So Russian defense industry can actually churn out Orlan-10s and Zala drones and Lancet-3 loitering munitions, which are actually very much in demand. It can also churn out these cheap drones, but again, the MOD was resistant to the idea that they have to sell to the warfighter, or they have to actually manufacture something that's very cheap, very small, very simple, and very expandable. And I think, I'll have to say, outside of this war, this is a problem that's probably not unique to Russia alone.
I'll just remind the audience that if you do have a look up in the nest, there are several tweets we put up from Sam, or some of them are tweets that came to my attention first from Sam, who highlighted them, that highlight some of the new types of drones that Russia is developing, including longer range twin engine versions, or they're noting use on the battlefield of particularly small sort of black fly ISR drones. So do have a look in the nest for resources that support the conversation that we're having. But Exit, I know that you had several questions for Sam, so why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little selfish and start at the very end of the report. You guys had a really quick little note about the USV attack on the Dakota Bridge that happened, and also a note about Russian Telegram kind of discussing Iranian-made USVs, and I'll share that to the nest in a second here. I would have expected to see like a continuation of those Russian USV attacks, but we haven't really seen them. Do we know if there's a production failure, if those USVs are simply kind of in testing still, and that's why we aren't seeing more of them? Is there any update to the idea of Iranians transferring their USV?
It's an excellent question, and I'll say that a lot of things right now in the Russian military don't make sense to me a year and a half into the war, and they probably don't make a lot of sense to a lot of people as well. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Russian military boasted of dozens of different types of USV and UUV projects, unmanned surface vehicles, unmanned underwater vessels. They were quite candid with some of the problems encountered in those testing and evaluation stages, but those designs, those projects actually were available. So it's not clear to me why some of those cannot be basically taken out of storage and utilized in the purely objective sense. Iran is in many ways a pioneer of a lot of drone technologies because as a country under sanctions for many decades, it was able to be quite successful in evading these sanctions and acquiring products and services that they need to manufacture quite sizable and competent drone force, both for UAVs as well as for maritime vessels. The reference you're making that compared one Russian attack to some of the Iranian tests is speculation. And it may be that this speculation is actually right on point, or maybe it's not. Right now, we're aware of a growing relationship between Moscow and Tehran in UAV manufacturing and transfer. And so earlier there were reports that Russia wants to build a factory in the eastern part of the country that can manufacture thousands of these drones a month. The fact that Russia is intensifying its Gerani attacks against Ukraine indicates that Russia may in fact be doing that, is license manufacturing a lot of these drones. It's not clear why USVs were not introduced yet. That technology may not be quite as mature for Iranians itself. But again, Russians are quite nervous about Ukrainian successes in testing and fielding different types of USVs against the Russian fleet. No doubt they're trying to copy those lessons and those technologies. They're claiming that there are certain projects already in the works that may be fielded soon, but I guess we'll see it when we see it. But right now, there's a lot of questions about what this Russian-Iranian relationship is and how successful it can be long-term in transferring even more military technologies to Russia.
Thanks for that. I know, Exit, you have a couple of questions, so feel free to go ahead with your next one or two.
Yeah, and so the other thing that's at the very end of the report that we don't hear very much about, Russia has a couple of UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles, the Marker specifically, and the Uran-6, which is a demining vehicle. Is there updates on those? Have we seen them in combat? Or do we know if they're producing them on a continued basis, or are they just quietly being used in the background?
Well, I think they're quietly used in the background. The Uran-6 and the Prokhod demining vehicles are used by Russians in the Donbass once they secure the area from the Ukrainian military and can operate in relative safety and security. The Uran-6 and the Prokhod operators have to be in close proximity to those demining vehicles, meaning if there are any Ukrainian UAVs or any other countermeasures present, they can cause a lot of problems for the Russian operators. And Russian media occasionally basically puts up a story of yet another Uran-6 used somewhere in the Donbass. The Marker UGV that you mentioned is a very interesting story. The Marker remains Russia's flagship project on utilizing different technologies, including swarming, machine vision, machine learning, and artificial intelligence for UGV operations in a swarm and UGV UAV operation in combat. And so the Marker was actually transferred to the Donbass, not to the military, but to one of those volunteer projects that we talked about last time. Dmitry Rogozin, who is a former head of the Russian Space Agency, and his Tsar's Wolves organization, volunteer organization that provides support to the fighters in the Donbass and develops and fields a lot of technologies that we have just described, including FPV, quadcopter, and other UAVs. So Rogozin claims that he's going to be using Markers, and the UGVs will actually be equipped with machine learning algorithms that would enable them to target Western tanks and other equipment. We haven't seen those tests in action. We've seen Markers used in a safe and secure environment where they fired something while being stationary. That's not something to be bragging about, of course, but Rogozin posted a lot of that information on his Telegram channel. This is obviously something of interest to many Russian military analysts right now. It's unclear if Marker will be fielded in the type of intense combat that is happening right now, where Western equipment is destroyed not by UGVs, but actual heavy assets like artillery, tanks, and multiple launch rocket systems. But we'll watch social media space for any clues as to what happens in Russia with respect to those technologies.
Thanks for that. So, Sam, I know you may only have another few minutes with us, so maybe I'll ask a double-barreled question, and you can respond to either of these as you like. What I would say is you, in the tweet of yours that you shared today, highlighting other work that is being done in the drone space by other organizations, that there have been some developments even since you put out this report in May. So I guess my first question would be, are there any updates from what's contained in the report that you would want to highlight? And then sort of a related question to that would be, given that we've seen a couple of changes in the dynamics of the type of drones used, particularly the push toward FPV drones, do you think that there are any other big swings in sort of types of drone use that we're only seeing hints of now that you think might become suddenly significant?
Well, I'll actually stay until 10 p.m. to give other people an opportunity to ask questions, and I will answer as follows. The biggest trend we've seen since the report actually went for editing was a very significant move towards FPV drones as the go-to source. Last year, everybody was talking about DJI drone, the Mavic, as the new face of combat. And this was actually quoted in our report because it's a statement from one of the Russian military generals, so it's quite respected in the country. The move towards FPV drones as, again, a completely expendable, attritable system that can operate at the tactical level is now forcing and necessitating further developments to the FPV concept, such as extending the range from, let's say, 7 to 10 kilometers to 20 kilometers. There are now other volunteer organizations and entire companies in Russia which are now manufacturing and proposing to the MOD their own loitering munitions, which can fly farther than a typical FPV drone. And another interesting trend is really kind of the intensification of the volunteer effort. That since we started writing the report, more efforts came to light, more organizations came together across Russia to fundraise, build specific technologies to test them and deliver them to the front in very large numbers. And so this is a war of not just the militaries, but also volunteers with their tech arsenals on both sides. And Ukraine had a lead in that. Ukraine was more successful in that. It's more flexible in combining military, government, private sector, and warfighter efforts into a network that selects the best technologies and then manufactures them at scale. Russia is trying to replicate that, but it's a very slow process. So right now, there are more and more volunteer efforts that are being stood up, which not only raise money, but develop these needed technologies. And so this move away from a DJI drone, which is very successful, but it can't really fly very fast or carry too much cargo. The move towards FPV drones is very interesting. And so now another development is creating, or at least trying to test, a reusable FPV drone that can drop a grenade or ammunition or an RPG warhead the way, for example, dive bombers used to do in World War II. So that this FPV drone flies at 100 kilometers at target, lobs a bomb and grenade, and then comes back. And so these technical trends are appearing probably with regular frequency. Every couple of weeks, something else pops up. And each side tries to copy the other's success. And we make a point in our report that the Russians are looking at the Ukrainians and trying to see what works for the Ukrainians and what can actually work for the Russians.
The battle of adaptation is fascinating, and now we'll know to keep our eyes open for sort of FPV bomber type drones to see if those do come to be more popular. So Sam only has 5 or 6 minutes with us left, so we'll see how many hands we can get through. I'm just going to go in the order they came up. So we'll go to Kitty first, and then Radio and Nukes. Go ahead, Kitty.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Yeah, Sam, I was noting in your report that of the 6,000 UAVs that were ordered by Russia from Iran, from the regime, the Russian forces are actually undergoing training in Iran for that. Do you know any idea like how many there would be? And then my second question is, interesting when you mentioned the Shahed 131, that a defining characteristic is that it has many electronic components made in the U.S., as well as civilian GPS systems. So I'm wondering how they could continue to supply that, and should be something we can target as, sanctions. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know how many Russians are undergoing training in Iran right now, but it's logical to assume that they do. Simply because operating Shahed/Geran isn't quite easy, and it actually takes some time. So I don't have a good sort of aperture as to what's happening there, but it probably is happening. And of course, Iranian trainers can actually train Russians in Russia proper. There was an attack on Crimea where Ukrainian military claimed they actually struck a training center and killed Iranian and Russian operators of Shahed drones, after which a lot of Russian strikes by these drones was subsequently conducted from Russian territory proper instead of Crimea. As far as commercial components, well, this is how Iran has basically navigated the sanctions and built up a massive drone force. Relying on commercial components means you're relying on technologies which are ever present and basically ubiquitous. And it's very difficult to sanction something that's used by everybody. And as we have seen and read in multiple exposés in the United States and in Europe about some of the schemes that Russia is using to import microchips and microelectronics, some of these schemes are quite ingenious. They work for a long time, and they can have a significant impact. And for every one that's uncovered, probably a dozen are still operating in the shadows or are evolving their tactics to avoid detection. So it's not always easy to just prohibit the flow of these technologies once the sanctions are announced, because it takes time. And again, Russia and Iran and other countries have built multiple supply chains and networks which can be replaced should one of them is discovered and destroyed. And so we have to be prepared for Russia and Iran to actually try to avoid sanctions for quite a while and import a lot of systems and a lot of technologies that they need to manufacture some of their military systems. Not all, but some of their military systems.
Thanks for that. Go ahead, Radio and Nukes.
Yeah, I had a quick question. I was looking at page 8, figure 2 of the report, and I see in the translated Russian graphic where it talks about a signal retrans aircraft. Have you seen any evidence of the use of radio relay aircraft, either crewed or uncrewed?
Well, it's a good question. Some of the Russian Orlan-10 drones actually act as those type of retranslators. In fact, one of the basic tactics is to fly several Orlan-10s. One is actually a retranslator that extends the signal, and the other one carries out its ISR or even combat mission, in which case the range of an Orlan-10 is extended from 120 kilometers max up to 300 kilometers. There are now lots of tests and lots of initiatives to do the same for quadcopters and FPV drones to extend their range from no more than 10 kilometers basically to 2 or 3 times that much. That way, tactical drones can actually become also operational long-range drones. The goal isn't just to strike an adversary at the line of contact. The goal is to strike in the adversary's rear, destroy and target and influence the line of communications, supply chains, and to target systems, storage, and everything that basically makes the military successful. And a lot of those efforts are far removed from the line of contact. And so there's a lot of work undergoing on both sides to develop certain types of retranslators to extend the range of different types of UAVs.
That's fascinating. We maybe have 30 more seconds. Can we squeeze one more question in?
Yeah.
Okay. Daniel, you have the last question. Go ahead.
Hey, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. So, I just had this is very fascinating information. I thank you very much for speaking so candidly about this. So, would it be accurate to say that in about 6 months' time, I'm starting to look at it that both sides have a ground war conflict where they've got troops on the ground and they have artillery and mechanized units backing up their troops, and then there's an Air Force domain where the Russians have some advantages. And then there's now a drone force domain where I'm sorry, I got a message that I was cutting off, but there's a drone force domain where the Ukrainians originally had the advantage, but it sounds like each people have are going to be having a few thousand units in the sky each. So it almost seems like there's going to be some parity there. And it sounds like, if I'm understanding this correctly, that both sides have sufficient production ramping up. So there could be roughly 1,000 units in the sky from each side being lost. Of those numbers, approximately what percentage do you think would be actively carrying munitions that could take out a mechanized vehicle of some kind?
That's a good question. I don't have a good sort of eye on that, simply because of the thousands of FPV drones, all of them can be rigged with ammunition to strike a target. Thousands of quadcopters can either basically do an ISR mission, or they can carry munitions to drop on top of targets. Many quadcopters can do both, and that's their advantage. First, a target is identified, and then a bomb is released. So there could be thousands of UAVs on both sides with both ISR and combat capability, and that's exactly the point, to saturate the front and to put the pressure on the defenders to expend ammunition, expose themselves, and therefore be targeted.
Okay, well, Sam, I know you have to go. There were lots of other fascinating items in your report. We'd love to have you back to chat about, including tactics with mixed types of drone use in the same attacks, where some take a recon role, others take an attack role. So there's lots more to talk about, but I know you have to go. So thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we speak to you again.
Thank you very much, and great to be back.
And once again, I'll encourage everybody to go and check out the report that Sam put out with the Center for Naval Analysis on Russia's use of uncrewed systems in Ukraine. And you can find that up in the nest. It's just back a few items. I'll try and move it up to the front again so it's easy for you to have a look at. Okay, so we probably, normally I'll run the space for 3 hours. Tonight I will have to stop a little shy of the 3 hour mark. So we have almost 2 hours to run through some Ukraine updates. Once again, because the space has gotten a lot larger since when we started. I run these conversations every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time and every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're covering the news, but with a distinct OSINT slant from here on Twitter. If you see anything that we're talking about that interests you, or if you were to scroll all the way to the right-hand side of the nest and look at the agenda, if you look ahead, if you see anything that interests you, please request a mic, come up, whether you have a question or a comment. So the subject that I wanted to start with in terms of updates was the developing offensive. And so in thinking about this, I had to think about, what tone to set in coverage of it, because the information is, it's so breaking. There's a lot happening on the ground. There are amazing counts that cover it specifically, but there are, details to think about. So the Ukrainians, for instance, have asked, as they have with past offensives, for a fair degree of radio silence for the purposes of operational security, both to respect that, and also because a consequence of that is that there just isn't a lot of detailed reporting coming out from a Ukrainian perspective, meaning that most of what we're hearing is coming from the Russians, whether it be from the Russian Ministry of Defense or from Russian mill bloggers, and that they obviously have significant biases, and they have, their track record is generally that they're putting out misinformation. So that's not a great way to start your analysis of this. Given that the increased pace of the offensive has picked up since Monday, with the most significant reports of movement along the front line really just in the last day or so, we really don't have a lot of detail. What I will note is that I have this section that I'll put back up at the front of the nest, that it's the tweet that's called Ukraine Overview, and that's where I put up the mappers. And there are, half a dozen good ones. There are 4 or 5 of them in this tweet. Andrew Perpetua, Institute for the Study of War, War Mapper, and the Project OWL Ukraine Control Map. If you want to follow things at a little more granular level, I'd encourage you to have a look at sources like that. When it comes to conversation in the space, probably what we'll be covering as we go forward, because the offensive is likely to continue for weeks or potentially months, will be material that is several days older, 3, 4, 5 days old, where most of the operational security concerns have passed. So the way I wanted to address it was kind of set that tone, but then also to show you at a high level that we're getting a lot of hot takes in both directions just a few days into the offensive. So if you have a look, starting with the second item in the nest, that's a tweet by Tyler Rogway, who is with the War Zone. They do terrific reporting. And this came out 1 day ago, and their headline is offensive going better than expected. And, that was based on comments that U.S. defense officials made, after essentially 1 day, perhaps 2 days of offensive. But then if you continue and look at the third and fourth items in the nest, you'll see that now CNN is coming out and saying that Ukraine forces are suffering from stiff resistance and losses. Or the fourth item back there, again, and this for Tyler Rogoway, it's from the same outlet, right? Where they're reporting on day one, it's going better than expected. Now they're saying Ukraine's big offensive kicks off to tough resistance. So I just want to highlight that there's going to be a lot of back and forth in these first few days, and that understanding that the fog of war exists, and it's often thicker for the many of us who are in North America, and that's probably for very understandable reasons, I think is an important expectation to set. If you have a look at the fifth item back in the nest, though, the U.S. I think had a healthy, or some in the U.S. government have a very healthy view of this. So that fifth item back is a tweet by Jeff Edmonds, and it's a write-up talking about how U.S. Defense Secretary Austin, has highlighted that, look, the offensive is going to have uncertainties within it. He's quoted there as saying that there will be stops and starts. There will be things that the Ukrainians will not anticipate, but there will also be opportunities for the Ukrainians to exploit. And so, if Secretary Austin can have this longer-term perspective, I'd encourage you guys all to be like Secretary Austin and wait for reliable reports to come out. Related to that, so these next two, the sixth and I think the sixth and seventh items back in the nest. So the sixth item back is a tweet by Timothy Snyder, who has done a terrific job as a historian covering the history of Ukraine, and just as a thoughtful person in general. And he wrote a thread. Now, he wrote it in the context of the destruction of the dam, which we'll speak to in a few minutes. But really what it is a thread that's about how to present the news. And he gets into some, fundamental points like don't present things as if they're calamities. Just because a Russian spokesperson has said something doesn't mean that it's true. Citing Russian claims on the same level as Ukrainian claims is generally unfair to the Ukrainians because the Russians have almost always spoken, untruthfully. And so I wanted to bring that item up in this, how do we think about the offensive point? Because this is the world that we live in, as I suggested a moment ago, for the next few days at least, where almost everything that's being published is from the Russian side. And we really fall in Tim Snyder's world of, even if we want to act as our own little journalists, we would be breaking several of his, very thoughtful recommendations, because the only thing we can present at the moment is the information from the Russian side, which is why, tonight we're not going to get into a lot of detail about that. Since we're talking about it at the media level and the types of coverage it will get, if you have a look at the seventh item back in the nest, it's a tweet by Shashank Joshi. And I thought this one was interesting because he is highlighting an article from Semaphore, and it's noting reports now that reporters for the New York Times and NBC have had their press credentials revoked by the Ukrainians in the last few days. Now, there, in some individual cases, there may be good basis for that. This is not a criticism of the Ukrainian approach. But it came to my attention as well because a journalist who writes for the Globe and Mail here in Canada also had his credentials suspended. And this just goes along with the theme I'm trying to highlight, which is that Western coverage not only is limited for OPSEC reasons, but because of concerns that the Ukrainians have about the fairness of Western coverage, they're actually limiting the number of Western media that is available to provide that coverage, which leaves us in a bit more limited position. And it will be interesting to see how that develops, whether maybe some of these journalists whose credentials are being held up might be slow-rolled, and that some of them will be granted in a few days once the offensive has proceeded a little bit further along, and if they're, for example, aiming at people who have been particularly critical of Ukraine in past offensives, then maybe it's a matter of timing as opposed to a matter of exclusion. But we'll have to wait and see on that front. So while we won't get into a ton of specifics, and I would direct you once again to some of those great accounts who are doing some of the mapping, including friends of ours like Andrew, who's in the audience. I will get into a couple of sort of general points in just a moment, but I see Exit has her hand up, so we'll go to you, Exit.
I had an hopefully interesting question occur to me. Wolverine, you've been in combat before. The differences between Ukraine trying to keep things quiet and on the down low versus what you would have dealt with media coverage. Is there anything that stands out to you in those two experiences?
So, like, the media coverage we had like reporters embedded with us, but most of the time I don't think they could like send their stories out in a time matter. But there were a lot of reporters there. When I was up in Tikrit, I got to live in hell surprise. I'd be by some woman, and I asked her, "Who are you with?" And she said, "The Wall Street Journal." And I said, "What the fuck is the Wall Street Journal doing in Iraq?" And I was like, "Whatever." So the thing is that we're with us, and we were staging out of Kuwait, so the Iraqis already knew. It's like, hey, this is the only place they can come from. So with us, they already knew, and we were set back so many miles. At least for the part where I was at, we had to stay back 30 miles from the border because there is a hill right inside of Iraq where the Iraqis you see that far into country. So we had to stay back a little bit farther back so they couldn't see us. Now Ukraine, though, the thing that Ukraine has is that they have such a long border that's the front right now. They can do psyop or propaganda or whatnot, and make them think, okay, we're gonna be here, just like we heard a lot of the stuff about, the amphibious operations. They're training, showing pictures for that. We didn't know where it was or if it still may go on because it could. But with a lot of the stuff that we have nowadays and that people use compared to what we had back then, especially when you do geolocating and just some of the more technology that we have now, they basically are using what they have and doing the best that they can do with what technology not only that they have but what the Russian side has too, because the Russians know the offensive is coming. They just don't know the exact spot, because they've got such a long border or a long front line. It's like 1,500 kilometers or something like that. So they can say, hey, they might be here, but they don't know. And with media, not having media, they can't, they can sit there and say, yeah, media can be with us, but they can sit there and say, hey, you can't post jack or anything for like so many days because, of what we're getting ready to do. The ComSec is also going to be another issue because of the electronic warfare assets that the Russians could be using, whether it be radio RDF, radio direction finding, which is where they can lock on to transmissions, and they don't necessarily need to hear what's being said in the transmissions, but what they can do is that they can sit there by how much transmission is going from one location to another location. They can kind of sit there and determine what size elements are doing the transmitting back and forth. So that's why they're going to want to keep keep a lot less communication so the Russians can't pick it up. Some of the things, like I said, when they have the crypto in the radios, which I don't know what they do during the war. That was one thing we had. We had crypto, and we also were doing with our crypto. We were also doing what's called free copying. And with the amount of gear that the Ukrainians are using, I don't also know if they're able to do that. And what free copying is like every couple of seconds, your radio automatically changes the frequency. But what happens is, because all your radios are timed at the same time, you can have 1,000 radios, and as long as they've all been timed properly, all those radios change frequencies at the same time. And with the crypto and with the free copying, even if the Russians were able to pick up on one frequency, they might only hear it for a couple seconds, but since it's also encrypted, that'd be a harder thing for them to pick it up. The only thing I don't know is how much encryption and how much stuff like the free copying and stuff like that the Ukrainians are able to actually use.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Wolverine. It's always interesting to hear about the experience of the veterans among us, particularly with regard to interaction with the media when we're on that topic. I'll go to Angry Ants, and then I'll keep going with updates. Go ahead, Angry.
Hey, thanks, Michael. This is actually a really awesome question that I haven't really heard asked very much. And I'll speak to the height of the OIF conflict, mainly from OIF 2 on, where the major actions were happening. And what I would say is that the U.S. government and NATO was able to control the narrative of that conflict at a much higher rate than what Ukraine is able to do right now here in the conflict today. You got to think about the lack of social media, the lack of, the very beginnings of MySpace and Facebook, were the very start of the Iraq war, right? I'm a senior citizen millennial, so I kind of bridge that little bit of a gap. And we were the first ones to use online banking and things like that. But also the reality of the fight in Iraq was that to get anywhere, you had to be military convoy. There was no behind the lines there. And also, so and there was big bases that reporters could hang out on, but the real combat happened across the rivers, across the bridges, where the combat outposts were. And yes, we did get reporters out there. We had reporters embedded, but the control of information that reporters got was very, very limited compared to what's going on right now. And it's both a good thing and a bad thing, I think. And I think there's a good give and take. But I will say that's the first time I heard it asked, and I've actually thought about that quite a bit, especially with the use of social media. It's just dramatic, the difference in it. Like the idea of having cell phones on a military base in 2005 or 2006 is like fucking mind blowing to me, But we did have MySpace and Yahoo Messenger. So, but OPSEC was much more easier to control. So, but when it comes to reporters, the access right now, it's such a hard. I could not understand exactly how Ukraine is actually handling it as good as they are because of the difficult situation. So that's just it. Sorry about the long-winded answer.
No, I appreciate it. Again, I appreciate the experience of those who have.
Mr. Bond,
seen it for.
Your mic's a little wonky. Maybe we'll give you a quick second to reset. And I will just do a quick housekeeping because actually we haven't done that yet tonight. If you're enjoying the space and you're enjoying what you're hearing and the different conversations we've had, you can go to the bottom right-hand corner. There is a little purple button. It'll bring up the space tweet and you can retweet that and bring some other people in to be part of this conversation. If you want to ask a question or you have something else to add to the conversation, by all means, hit the request button and we'll see if we can bring you up. And I believe Mr. Bond's back. We'll go back to him. Thank you.
Thanks for letting me know. For those who don't know, I run these spaces on an emulator on PC, and every so often it gets a little glitch in the mic, so I just have to reset it. So anyway, again, thanks to Angry Ants. I always appreciate the direct experience that people have had. And, while social media complicates the sphere, there's also just the fact that Ukraine has been so much more successful in its use of sort of grassroots level reporting, and that, I'm sure they, you don't want to kill the golden goose, so to speak. And I'm sure they're very aware of that. And so it's that challenge of both keeping everybody very enthusiastic for their amazing work, but at the same time making sure that they keep their plans as secure as possible. So some sort of general updates related to the offensive, starting with the second item in the nest. Just in the last day, there have been many reports of heavy use of munitions by the Ukrainians, HIMARS and related. This is just one example of Russian reports to that effect. So when I talk about being reluctant to use Russian reports, where the Russians are talking about Ukrainian successes, generally you would assume that's counter to their normal bias, and so you would take it as being that somewhat reliable. So I will occasionally make use of those reports, and so there were reports of HIMARS and similar bombardment being used on targets closer to the front lines, as opposed to their use for the last few months in much deeper strikes. And the suggestion was that it may be possible the Ukrainians are using those strikes closer to the front lines in an effort to, support breakthrough attempts that would follow. And it was interesting, that second tweet in the nest coming from Russian mill bloggers about their realization that the HIMARS bombardments several months ago when they first arrived were at a really rapid pace, but they seem to have slowed for a few months prior to this, but that it's not likely that's because they were getting low on ammo at that time, but more that they were stockpiling it, and that it's anticipated they should have considerable reserves of it available to them now. In other sort of general news connected with the offensive, the third item back is an order put out by the Russian-appointed governor in Zaporizhia ordering evacuation of residents from several regions. This one caught my eye because it included evacuation from Tokmak. Now, others have pointed out that several regions nearer to the front, evacuations were announced, I think, 2 weeks ago. So this isn't completely brand new news, but it does appear to be applicable to some regions deeper behind the line, and kind of hints at Russian thoughts on where the offensive may head. Go ahead, Exit.
I just wanted to note that this one caught my eye as well, but purely because apparently they can encourage evacuation, except for when a dam blows, and then they can't help anybody.
Yeah, the contrast is jarring at the moment, that's for sure. And I did want to acknowledge through the next couple of tweets in the nest that there are reports coming out of the fact that Ukraine is suffering some losses, and there were fairly credible reports in the last day or so of those losses, including some Western systems, potentially some advanced Western systems. And I want to set that in context. So the fourth item back looks like it may be the first loss of a Leopard. It's identified here by Ukraine Weapon Tracker as a 2A4. Now, when we say loss, it's not clear that all of these are completely destroyed. They may just be, combat ineffective. They may be in regions where they can be recovered. So, I don't want to make too much of it, but these are the sorts of things that are being highlighted by the Russians as significant developments. And I just want to acknowledge that it's entirely possible that some of these are true. These ones from these reliable accounts are more likely to be true. We'll get to fakes in just a moment. But I see this has generated a couple of hands, so I'll take those and then keep going. Go ahead, Angry Ants.
Yeah, Mike, and I think that you've heard me on my soapbox once or twice in the last few months talking, like preparing as many people as I could for this moment to make sure people understood that, there are going to be losses. A Leopard A2 or 2A4 is not invincible, right? If an artillery round hits it, it's going to have a hard time, surviving it. So, I believe there are some credible losses. We're going to see credible losses, but that's why we're sending these vehicles over there, because things have to be done. One that case, I think that there was a really good thread. I'm trying to remember which account did it that kind of overlooked it, and it was kind of a unique situation where it was an artillery barrage that took them out, and I think there was 4 leopards took it out. That were confirmed from all the different sources that were available, and it was done by artillery. So, it sounds really bad, but it's 4 tanks. It is a bad thing, but again, situations happen. War is war, and vehicles are going to get destroyed. But 4 leopards looks really, really bad. And what I've been saying for months is the idea that the minute that we saw Western vehicles start to get hit, you were going to see an onslaught of information driving people to talk about how big of the issue it is. So there is probably even more than this, but just kind of keep that in the back of your mind that these vehicles are meant to get blown up and hopefully protect the people in it.
I haven't seen the report of 4 leopards in one instance. So I mean, if you have any material on that, we can have a look. But it's as we're both saying, the point is not, are they taking losses? It's that, are they taking losses, in a reasonable way and achieving their ends, and that what they're attempting is a very difficult thing. So it's, understandable, and hopefully not. The point is that it shouldn't be overblown for what it is. We'll go to Jacoby and then Wolverine.
I suspect Wolverine will probably say stuff that will make my question sort of moot. But for someone who doesn't really have a whole lot of context of why looking at these particular vehicles that they're saying they're taking out, why that is deemed to be so significant from their standpoint versus contextually, if that makes any sense.
So basically asking, like, why is it a big thing? Because a Leopard 2A4 got taken out?
Essentially, yeah. Like, what, I mean, to me, it seems like you put those things out there, some of them are going to get taken out. Shocker. But perhaps I understand less context than I should.
I mean, it's mainly, when they say, oh my God, Leopard 2A4 got taken out, well, the Russians use that for propaganda because they say, oh, this is all the brand new Western equipment that the Ukrainians got. And oh, by the way, we took this out. Realistically, like Angry Ants was saying, anything gets hit with a 152 or 155 on it is pretty much dead. It doesn't matter what vehicle it is. So, to them say that, oh my God, they lost a Leopard 2A4. All right. Shit happens. I mean, when you look at some of the maps, you look at some of the units that are going in there, against the defensive positions that they have to go against, it's understandable that they are going to lose armor. And when you're on the battlefield like that, the first thing they're going to go after is the heaviest fight, the heaviest vehicles that can cause the most damage to you, So if I'm a grunt and I'm in a fighting position, I've got like a TOW or a javelin or something like that. If I see like 4 BMPs and a tank, well, guess what my first target is going to be? The tank, because the tank can do the most damage to me. So because of the heavier armor and stuff like that. The BMPs are less because they have lighter armor. They don't have, and they can be taken out. Like a BMP-2 can actually be taken out by anything above a 50 caliber 12.7. So like a 14.5 could actually take a BMP-2 out. So with that case, I'm going to go after the biggest and heaviest target out there that can actually hurt me. One of the things that people need to realize is this, is you got to look at the design of the armor that the Ukrainians are using, the newer stuff that they got, compared to the newer stuff that the Russians are using, like, the T-72B3 over 2022s, or even the T-90, T-90Ms. And it's the design of the tank. So, like on the Western side, we look at a tank, like if an M1A1 got hit, which, not many did, but a couple did. But if it gets hit in the ammo area, well, guess what? the ammo area is toast, but guess what? Rest of the tank may be fine because the tank is designed to do that. So just because you lost that, you may not have lost the crew, because depending on how that vehicle is designed and if it has a blow-off panels and stuff like that, it may take a direct hit and the tank may take some damage, but it could also be, though, that your crew is actually still alive. And then, it's easier to replace a tank than having to try and sit there and train guys all over again to actually use that tank.
Well, thanks for that question and answer. I think it was Angry Ants and then Gurney, and then we'll get back to updates.
Yeah. So, and just to kind of go back to Jacoby's point, I think one of the most important parts of this is that Russia has only so many options left. The door is closing on them, and they're going to do whatever they can to try and bring this to whatever kind of end that allows them to save face. And one of the only ways that they can do that is through political will and being able to change the way people perceive the conflict. So one of the things that Ukraine has been up against from day one is the response to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and how the misunderstanding of how military equipment is allocated to other countries and stuff like that really goes down. And that has been a problem, when it comes to supporting Ukraine from day one. And it's something that I know for a fact that that has gone into many of the thinkings when it comes to this. So when you start to, when you see a massive amount of propaganda, like the entire, Hail Mary attempt from Russian propaganda is what we're about to see. And it's going to be pointed at the idea that people's taxpayers' dollars are getting blown up on the field, et cetera, et cetera. That's why it's so important that why this conversation is so important, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. Go ahead, Gurney.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, but I think Angry sort of touched on it indirectly here. I was going to ask, have the reasons for why we're going to see a focus on these videos of the Western tanks and equipment been discussed? And I think Angry touched on it, but maybe I'll just elaborate and put my twist on it here. And it's just that, if it hasn't been explicitly said, but it's probably understood by many here, right? I think it's important to just explicitly say it. If we see pictures of Western equipment, why would Russia want to amplify that? And again, sorry to belabor the point here, but the why is because it would seek to discourage funding. It would seek to discourage future equipment deliveries to Ukraine. It would seek to, have some sort of political stalemate or some sort of giving up in terms of seeing these losses. And I say that why would that discourage it? Well, because there's sort of been a buildup to this in terms of expectations, right? Expectations don't always meet reality, and expectations can get artificially inflated. So it's a good conversation to have. And I just want to say, so explicitly, Russia seeks to build off of unrealistic expectations that we may have built for ourselves, or that others may have built, and to play off of that, to discourage future support, that they would seek to tell people it's a lost cause, it's futile, you're just going to lose equipment and people, or that this is not winnable. And so I think it's very important to just explicitly state that that's one of their many motivations as to why this will occur. Not to just talk about that it will occur, but to talk about the why for that. So thanks.
Absolutely, and that's why I wanted to bring it up as a subject. So I'm glad that these points are being so well reinforced. I know other hands are up. I will get to them in just a moment. Just before that, two items, some administrative. I didn't have an opportunity to mention it earlier, but friends of ours are streaming this conversation to YouTube as well. The link to that is now the first item in the nest. Our friends who help us out with that had been away for, I think, 2 sessions, so it's good to be back. I got, my DMs were overwhelmed when I explained that because we got the 100,000 likes on the last YouTube video that I had shaved, and people were very upset that they couldn't see. So now you can go over to the YouTube channel and see that I have in fact shaved. And you can always check out past episodes. I'd encourage you to join us here on Twitter so you can participate in the conversation, because you can't do that on YouTube. But if you ever miss an episode or want to go back, you can check out the channel there.
Hey, Michael, what's the channel's name? I'm sorry. Maybe there's some folks that don't know how to look that up. I'm one of them.
Sure. Yeah, it's OSINT-TV. And the link to it is in the nest. It's the first item. And you can click that link to YouTube, and it will take you to the current live stream. And then, of course, you'll see the channel as well. And I had mentioned that even though we're not going into too much detail about the offensive tonight, we will get to it, in future sessions once there's more reliable information from Ukrainian and other Western sources. But in addition to the mappers I provided earlier, for example, the second item in the nest is a post by Rob Lee, who is great and reliable. And he, as I mentioned, sometimes the Russians, mill bloggers will make concessions about Ukrainian gains. And so where they're sort of making concessions, particularly Rob in this one example has cross-referenced similar statements and concessions from 4 or 5 different accounts. That gets to be a little bit more reliable, just as an example of how to figure it out. Also, it's a ways back now, but I'll go to hands in a moment. I wanted to highlight it's now the seventh and eighth item back in the nest. In addition to that one apparent leopard loss, a video came out just yesterday, apparently of the loss of a radar system for the EEST. And I just, want to acknowledge that some of these valuable systems, unfortunately, are being lost. I know with the EEST, some are saying maybe it was a decoy. It's possible. I don't know about that. In that the more common a system is, the easier or more value there is in creating a decoy of it. Perhaps it is, but in any event, it's looking like it may have been the loss of a fairly valuable system to a Lancet, as our guest Sam mentioned, was one of the more dangerous Russian tools. And then the eighth item back in the nest is just to play on what everybody's been commenting, including Gurney, that Russia wants to amplify the idea of loss of Western equipment, to be demoralizing. That eighth item back in the nest is a tweet by Defmon, where he's showing an effort to create a fake image of a destroyed Leopard, where you can see the original image of a destroyed tank, where somebody took the background track and the smoke and so on, but then took a similar angle of a Leopard from a different photo and integrated it in an effort to make it look like it was the Leopard that had been destroyed. And so there will probably be a lot of that. We haven't talked about them as much in the last month or two, but the terrific work being done by Oryx and his team, including Nalcio and several, Jacob and Dan Spian and a bunch of his crowd, some of whom will come in and chat with us. And that they are doing a great job trying to confirm what's real and not double counting and so on. So I'd suggest going to folks that have a proven track record of doing that kind of work. Okay, we'll go to hands and then we'll move on to new subjects. I think it was Jane and then Wolverine. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, this is quick. Everybody has sort of said this, even you, in one way or another, but I think that the message ultimately with the Leopards and the radar installation and anything else that we see coming up is that ultimately Russian hardware, for the Russian audience, Russian hardware and Russian tactics are superior to NATO tactics. That's also going to feed into the negative feedback loop on funding in the United States. And, information is so dynamic right now. I'm also sure, in fact, I know that I saw a few AI altered photographs today. And the sources were very sketchy, and I didn't have a chance to grab them, but destroyed, American hardware, destroyed German, other Leopards unrelated to this incident. So I think we're about to see a flood of potentially deep fakes and things like that. So keep your eyes out for that stuff, folks. But yeah, this is all about, what's better and, who's better than the other guy, and our side is winning. If you want to control the narrative, if you are the Russians. So, for what it's worth. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. We'll go to Wolverine, and then we'll move on to updates on the dam.
So one thing I just want to kind of point out, so if everybody looks at the third item back in the nest, it'll say Ukraine control map. One thing you can, if you want to learn, see, and find out what is potentially going on and stuff like that. So if you look at the map, you're going to have basically everything is a square, but it has different items inside of them. And what those are called unit identifiers. And what they do, I think that's the right term, but what they basically do is they tell you, A, what type of unit it is, and then B, depending on what's above it, the size of the unit. So like right now, if you were to look at that map, along the line, if you really look at like all the combat units that are along the line, there's only 2 mechanized infantry units that are actually engaged in the fighting. Well, it might be 3. I just found a third one. They're engaged in the direct fighting here. Okay. Now one of those units is a company-sized unit, so that's only 14 tanks. This one I can't tell because it's covered up by the name of a city. There's 1 mechanized infantry brigade, and it's actually over by Mala Tokmak. And then there is another mechanized infantry company over by Orkiv. Now the thing though is you've only got that much armor, and everybody's talking about all this armor and stuff like that the Ukrainians have. But if you look back up like to the top of that screen just a little bit, you're going to have 3 units. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I saw another map. There's more, but what they are is they're a square. They're a rectangle. It's got like an oval in the middle of it, and then it's got a cross in it. Those are mechanized infantry units, and the ones that are on there that are depicted are brigade-size elements. So if you see, there's 1, 2. There's potentially 3 mechanized infantry brigades. There's also an armored brigade, 2 armored brigades, and a mech infantry company. They're not even committed to the fight yet. They're far back off. They're not being used. So that'll give you kind of what they're going against.
And so, Wolverine, I appreciate your highlighting that. Sometimes because we've been discussing these things in spaces for such a long time, I take for granted the background that people have. So I appreciate you pointing out, and inspired by your comment, if you have a look at the first item in the nest, the marking that Wolverine was explaining to you is NATO symbology. And we've discussed it in past spaces, but now the first item in the nest links, it's that same account, Ukraine Control Map, who said that occasionally they get asked about the NATO symbology. It's standard, it's not their invention. And included in that tweet is a link to the concept just on Wikipedia, which is a great starting point because there are so much variety in marking that it would take, I'm sure Wolverine could hold his own spaces to explain it all. But as a start, I'd suggest have a look at those resources. Okay, so I'll move on to some updates about the dam. Now, there's a fair bit to cover because there's just a lot of interesting detail that flows from the destruction of the dam. So I'm going to go through things fairly fast. I'm still I welcome any comments or questions. But what I'll probably do is run through, blocks of 4 or 5 updates, and then I'll pause to take any comments before moving on to the next blocks. I'm also assuming that most of you have heard some of the basics about the dam's destruction because there have been, spaces on it every day. We're now 3 or 4 days out from the events, so we're not going to get into too much of the basics. We'll move over that quickly, and then we'll get into little details. Starting with the second and third items back in the nest, just if you haven't seen the fundamentals of what happened, there were several great sort of overview threads that were done. Some of them took the form of like breaking news or real-time updates, so they're maybe not structured in a completely explanatory way, but they will bring you up to speed on all the basics. So the two I've put up there are by Mark Krutov, who's with Radio Free Europe, and the third item in the nest is the thread by Eric Toller of Bellingcat, and they were two good examples, but there were several other good ones out there as well. Again, so for just overall background, the fourth item back in the nest is a tweet by our friend David Helms, who looks carefully at weather and water, and he found a great resource that's linked there that is sort of a map and explanation of the significance of the different parts of the Dnipro River system, because it has lots of tributaries, and it has people may not realize that indeed it has 3, 4, 5 dams along its length, and each has its own reservoir, and so understanding how those relate and will feed into the water flow through the recently destroyed dam at Nova Kakovka, it's important background. The fifth item back in the nest is also highlighting, it's by Euromaidan Press, that this is not the only dam that has been destroyed by Russia. So by phrasing it that way, this is not the only dam that is in Russian-occupied territory that has been destroyed. And in particular, some dams were explicitly destroyed in other regions of Zaporizhia in the last few days, which is important context. We discussed it at the time. But if you're not familiar with that, check out that article by Euromaidan Press. Those others were far smaller, far less significant. They tended to be more like water reserves, as opposed to large reservoirs for the purposes of hydro generation. And also, one question I always like to ask early in the process is, well, so what happens now? At the really high level. So that sixth item back in the nest, the article from the Kiev Independent, is noting the statement of officials that they will rebuild this dam, but they're estimating that it may take 5 years and $1 billion to rebuild it. I'll note that one other source I saw, it was Meduza, the Russian language media company, who reported on it differently, saying that they believed it would cost 1 billion hryvnia, which works out to only something like $30 million. I'm pretty sure that was their mistake, and I pointed it out to them, but I don't know that they've issued a correction yet. But just as between $1 billion US dollars and 1 billion hryvnia, I'm pretty sure the number quoted by the official was $1 billion US dollars. Exit, go ahead.
Just on that valuation, I've seen others report much, much higher numbers for that valuation. So I would say that we probably, A, don't really have any idea right now, and B, need to wait for more information before we can even start to evaluate that. Because you'd need to remove parts of the old dam. There's all sorts of structural things you'd have to do to be able to even assess that right now.
And that's a fair point. I think you may actually be referring to.
Hi, your microphone needs a reset. We'll go to Jacoby for a quick second.
I just had a comment about that. When I hear, talk of like, oh, we're going to rebuild this, we have all these big plans to, fix what, has been destroyed. I wholeheartedly support that, and at the same time say, focusing on winning the war and, having good plans for, rebuilding infrastructure second, it's that order that I think of, but, because cross that river with a dam when we get to it, kind of thing. Because who knows what could happen between now and then, and trying to evaluate infrastructure projects before there's regional stability strikes me as an exercise in futility a little bit.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I think that the statement quoted by the Kiev Independent about rebuilding the dam is more of a, there would be immediate questions about what the intention is, because the reservoir itself isn't going to change position and so on. So the expectation would be they would probably rebuild it. So perhaps they may be getting ahead of themselves a little bit in pacing and price, but it may be largely an aspirational or motivational statement just to say, whatever Russia may destroy, we will rebuild. We'll go to Brian, and then I'll keep going with updates.
Build a dam over the river when we get to it. I love that reference there. I think it was, thank you, Gooey. Well played. There is a and I hope that the shaving ceremony was recorded so we can watch it later. There does happen to be a combat engineer person here that I had interacted with previously. So if he's interested in coming up and giving his perspective on that, would there be some, reason why to build a dam, maybe, or is there a temporary solution that could be implemented that would have some military and or civilian value? He wants to come up and speak to that, and just wanted to put out the invitation because I happen to remember that he had that particular expertise. That's it.
Well, if that mystery guest knows that they're being talked about, they're always welcome to come up and contribute. So the next block on the dam that I wanted to talk about was, I don't want to re-litigate the debate about whether the dam was blown up or whether it collapsed. Perhaps we can get a couple of pieces of opinion on that, but I think that there is some evidence, and I'm going to bring that forward in a moment, but that a lot of it at this point is speculation. And so, we'll put the evidence out there, and if you guys want to discuss it further, we can a little bit. I don't know that a lot of the debate that goes on tends to happen in an absence of evidence situation, and I don't think that's necessarily productive. But first, I wanted to get out of the way any suggestion that Ukraine may have caused the destruction of the dam. I doubt many in here would, have that opinion. But just as evidence of how difficult it would be for that theory to be true, that first item in the nest by Smart Ukrainian Cat is noting, because the Russians have possession of the dam, he's pointing to when the Ukrainians destroyed the Kazarovichi Dam near Kiev in order to flood fields to slow the oncoming Russian advance, that it took, what's he say? That they tried it twice, and that they tried the first time with 1,000 kilograms of TNT and some mine clearing charges. That didn't work, and then they had to try it again, setting it deeper under the footing of the dam, again with 800 kilograms of TNT. And in that case, it destroyed that dam, and that dam is much, much smaller. And so without direct access to it, there's, essentially no chance that somebody could destroy the dam. So I just want to get that theory out of the way. With regard to, I don't know that there's sufficient evidence at the moment to resolve as between whether the dam failed structurally for one or more reasons, or whether an explosion was used to breach the dam. of course, I want to make clear that from my perspective, it's not relevant. Russia would be responsible in either case. For those making the argument that it may have collapsed for structural reasons, I've put up 2 threads. They are the second and third items up. The first of them is a thread by the account Draft in Depth, and then the other is by our friend of the space, Intel Schizo. And they, set out some details. Schizo managed to locate some of the original survey work for the dam, showing sort of the soil type beneath it. The thread by Draft in Depth shows what appears to be a slow progression of damage over the last 2 weeks, with a portion of the road being destroyed. I'm sure you've seen those photos. He also points to damage from the jetty right beside that section of road, suggesting there may have been some undermining of the dam directly. And I mean, so I'm not a civil engineer, but it certainly does look like sections near where the break occurred were beginning to fail in various ways before the full dam collapsed. And if somebody can explain it, that doesn't prevent the possibility that it was sustaining some natural damage, and then it was also blown up. The two can both have been occurring at the same time, but it certainly does appear that some structural damage was occurring over the days before it collapsed. I'll also note in the fourth item, back in the nest, that the conflict intelligence team, who does fairly thoughtful OSINT work, also sort of came to that same conclusion. And so there are several voices on that side. Next, I will go on to some of the recent evidence that's developed that it may have been an explosion. But before if you're going to argue it's an explosion, maybe you can hold your comments until we get through that. But otherwise, we will go to hands. So we'll go to Aaron and then Wolverine.
Sorry, my comments were on the explosion, so I'll wait till later.
Sure.
Thanks.
Sure. Wolverine, go ahead.
So one thing that I was, when I was hearing about this stuff and how people were talking about, was it an explosion or whatnot, one thing that you can actually look up, and it actually happened here in the United States, was the Oroville Dam in Northern California. Now, obviously, it's a different type of dam, but the main cause of the dam failing, and the parts of it was that it was actually due to erosion from the water from a spillway. So if you actually want to see something that actually has a lot of information about it, can be readily found, which would give you an example and kind of, so you can see what happens with a dam when it's actually almost taken out by erosion. That's actually a good one, is the Oroville Dam in Northern California.
Yeah, I've seen video of the failure of that dam, and it's very interesting. To understand what the type of effect might be, I totally get that. I just try not to draw comparisons because I'm not a civil engineer, so I don't know. I presume that the specific design and dam style would have a lot to do with how it's susceptible to structural damage. So moving on to what evidence there is for it to have been an explosion. So looking at the first item in the nest, Eric Toller here cites the Ukraine Hydro project. And my understanding is that they are engineers and that they had come out and said that the hydropower plant was designed to be extremely strong, and that it would take a huge amount of explosive or a huge amount of energy to destroy it, and that it likely would have required explosives for that purpose. A related argument I saw, although I don't know that I have the link to it right at hand, was a point suggesting that the concrete portions of the dam were built in several slabs, and the fact that it appears that several of the slabs broke would suggest a coincidental damage to all of them, which would be consistent with an explosion, as opposed to a failure where one or two concrete panels could potentially have been naturally destroyed, but it's unlikely that quite so many would have been. Now, whether you find that convincing is up to you. There are two other pieces of evidence to consider, starting with the second item back in the nest. Again, so Eric Toller just happened to bring these all together, so he's quote tweeting most of the points I'm speaking to. So in this case, he has a tweet from Richard Cordero, who those following Ukraine have probably seen his tweets. He is a researcher who does work with electromagnetic fields in the atmosphere. And he, for months, has been claiming that he can detect rocket launches and explosions using magnetometers. Not magnetometers that he owns, but sort of at research facilities that make their data public. And he's saying that he's detected something that may line up with the time of the collapse of the dam, and that the magnetometers would only detect an event associated with it if it were an explosion. Now, I just want to put a caveat in here that I've followed his claims, and I think that he, in several cases, has claimed to detect things that it doesn't seem like he can prove he has actually detected. So I'm pretty skeptical of some of his claims. It doesn't mean that the method he describes cannot work at all, just that his application of it seems to have been a stretch. And so when quote tweeting it here, Eric Toller also noted that according to the graph that he presented, it appeared that the magnetometers detected an explosion potentially 20 to 30 minutes after the first reports of destruction of the dam. So he's suggesting that the timeline may not fit for that as a piece of evidence either. I know there are a couple of hands, but I'm just going to run through these last 2 points, then we'll get to them. So starting with the third item back in the nest, this may be the most convincing point of data. It's a report that was put out by an organization called, where is it? Sorry, just bear with me. An organization called NORSAR that I believe is in Norway, and it uses seismographs for various purposes, not only for seismology, but apparently they also work in monitoring the nuclear test ban treaty. And so they're monitoring vibrations from explosions, potentially very distant. And so they would have some experience using seismology to look at explosions, although presumably distant, but on a much larger scale than would be associated with the dam. But they came out and said that they detected a signal at a monitoring seismograph in Romania that they think time-wise lines up with the destruction of the dam. And if you were to scroll down in that thread, you can actually see the interaction that I had with the account who posted it. So this is posted by D. Mojavensis, who does good OSINT work. And I had an interaction with him where in the replies I asked, well, but if it were a structural failure, could it also be detected on a seismograph? Perhaps not. If a natural failure is more gradual, it may not create a signature like this. And he came back in the replies and noted the account of an individual named Quentin Prasad, who, and I'll put his tweet up individually, who said that his team at NORSAR, using the seismographs, concluded that the recorded signals showed the characteristics of an explosive source. So it appears they are claiming not just that it's consistent with, but that it is indicative of an explosion, presumably to the exclusion of structural collapse. Now, I don't have enough technical expertise to evaluate that in detail yet. However, if you look at the fifth item back in the nest, that same account, Quentin Brassard, put out a paper back in March on their use of seismic and acoustic data to detect large-scale and well-reported assaults, like as in, attacks with large explosions. So they've been attempting this work for quite a while. And in that report, I expect they'll have more technical detail if you want to understand how they're doing the analysis. I only came across that this afternoon and haven't had a chance to read it, but I wanted to present the source to you. That is the best source that I've seen suggesting an explosion. However, if you look at the sixth item back in the nest, once again, Eric Toller is suggesting he thinks even the detection by seismograph may have occurred 20 to 30 minutes after the first reports of damage to the dam. Now, these timing claims, again, I'm relying on Eric, who is a very thoughtful guy working for Bellingcat. But it's seeming like it's now a contest of claim as between can the seismographs detect this type of an explosion? If so, does the timing match up? If all of those things are resolved, that would seem to be strong evidence of an explosion contributing to the collapse of the dam. I'm not trying to take a both sides thing. I just don't think that the evidence is conclusively demonstrated to me yet, although it may be there. So I know we have several hands up. I think the order may have been Jane and then Gurney and then Whiskey. So we'll go to Jane first.
I think that Whiskey was first, if you want to go with him. I just have one quick thing I want to say, Michael. The basically all of the nuclear weapons, the United States has been using seismographs as the way that we've detected any nuclear blasts, even microburst testing in Russia, which is pretty much the only type of nuke testing that's been done. And I don't even know, I'd have to check to see the last time any activity was recorded, but that is considered the gold standard. And there's a very clear, we've really worked our butts off when we've had what are, referred to as listening posts, but they're basically seismology stations near to Russian testing facilities. When the Iranian Revolution occurred, we lost a large facility on the Russian-Iranian border, and so we moved it to the Chinese border. But there are some very clear, very unquestioned mathematical calculations that can be done to tell you speed, distance, approximation, what's breaking up, how hard the rock is, how big the blast was, even if it's, at this point, a nanoblast. And it can be anything of any sort. But the seismology would be the way to go on this. It'd be a very interesting thing, though, if that dam had some baseline damage to it structurally. It'd be very interesting to know whether it, it's a complicated question, but it would be awfully easy to take that dam down if it had damage, of any sort to it. But, for what it's worth, know that the seismographs are, by and large, considered to be the best way to figure out what's going boom and where.
Yeah, thanks for that. Right. And I'll reiterate that we're not discussing cause in order to determine, whether Russians are blameworthy or not, but it may be relevant to include, if they did intentionally destroy the dam, that may give indications of their willingness to destroy other critical infrastructure, where we all know that they still control several pieces of Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Whereas if it was accidental, then, that presents a different set of risks for those other positions that they hold. I'll also note that potentially the specific charging mechanism under international law may differ depending on intention, which is not, insignificant. So apologies if I got the order wrong, but we'll go to whiskey and then we'll go to Gurney.
Hey, thank you, Michael. The only thing I was going to add was, and I don't know if this is relevant to the current conversation, but as far as like looking into the seismograph data, there was in February of 1986, there was a dam failure in Auburn, California. It wasn't due to explosives or anything like that. It was just basically an erosion problem. But if any of that data, if it's on the seismographs, can be compared to the Nova Hukova dam failing, it'd be kind of interesting to see those two things compared. Thank you.
It would be. Maybe, but would also hopefully they're comparable seismologically. I just don't know enough about how easy it would be to compare those things. But that and the Oroville example were both interesting items. So we'll go to Gurney and then exit.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So this comment is to the data slide there, and maybe to Jane's comment here. So taking the seismograph out of it for a second, right? I don't. Not that a seismograph is right. The tool is only as good as you use it, and so I guess this is my just commentary to this. A seismograph could be a gold standard for something, but the reason it's a gold standard is because most things that have been analyzed through seismographs, they've been fingerprinted to some degree. And what is that what you can interpret from the seismograph, if it has likely characteristics and repeatable characteristics, such as a nuclear explosion, especially in a very, very brief amount of time, they're likely reproducible. And so this is my comment to that slide. I'm looking to hear more information from that group, from that North Star group. It's interesting. It has potential. But when I look at reproducibility in some of these companies that purport or propose to add data, they show something that looks like a piece of data, but it doesn't really tell you much information. It doesn't give you behind the black box, the proprietary, algorithm that they say they're analyzing it with. And I would love to get behind this, because one of the problems I think that we get here is there's a lot of times people will take post-event data and claim to match it to an event, whether it's detection, whether they're looking for groundwater. I mean, you name it. But as long as you know the event occurred, and this happened, if a lot of people in the OSINT space know this happened with the Malaysian flight that dropped off the radar way back, 10 years ago now, where groups were claiming to reproduce data or using different signals to locate where they thought the plane was, but that's because they had the hindsight, the post-event knowledge, and we're using that to trace back. And some of it was found to be not credible, as it was not reproducible. Not that there wasn't some sound potential science behind it that was credible. There's always a kernel of truth to it. So I'm looking forward for more information, because it could be interesting if this Norwegian group could show and express to the world how they come to their conclusions, and exactly what fingerprint they see, because the seismograph is just detecting certain types of waves, right? So to discriminate one type of event from another, and I want to say this, a dam of a certain dimension in a very specific area, whether there was an explosion and it was crumbling, that fingerprint is not going to be in anyone's record books anywhere. That's going to be a unique one-off occurrence. Now, perhaps there was some kind of explosion that preceded it that is highly identifiable in fingerprint. I'm interested to see more data from those guys. I dislike it when the conclusion page is shown and very little data or ability to look underneath the hood of the black box is given. And I'd love for them to just share their analysis, not just the analysis, but their methodologies behind it. I find the same to be true with the Richard Cordero. There's some stuff that looks like it has some provenance with it, but I've never been able to actually get behind the hood, and it seems like it could be a case of fitting the data to an event that's occurred. Thanks.
Yeah, I was just going to use the term fitting the model. I don't think it's speaking out of turn because this exchange was public, but when Mr. Cordero first published his claims, I took them as potentially very valuable. And I had said to him, hey, do you have any reports that you've published on how you analyze these so that we can get a sense of whether these tools can detect, what's their sensitivity? Can they detect explosions of a certain size or rocket launches to a certain altitude, understand the constraints? And he responded to me publicly and said, I'm sharing these so that other researchers can work with me to validate my theories, but I don't have any of that. To which to me made me think like, oh, you don't have evidence to support your claim. And that kind of put me off the magnetometer claims. And then interestingly, a few days later, he deleted that public reply. So, I'm don't put a lot of weight in it. To that idea of fingerprinting it, now that the dam has been destroyed, maybe it's a way out there question, but I wonder whether Ukraine, after reseizing that territory, which I have every confidence they'll do, I wonder if they could actually recreate the test, put 1,000 kilograms of explosives in roughly the same position, detonate it, and then see what the signature looks like at the Romanian seismograph. I mean, and if it matches, that could be an interesting, convincing argument. I apologize. I didn't see the order. I think it was, I'm going to go with my co-hosts for co-host prerogative. I think it was Exit, Radio and Nukes, and then Brad.
So just in the interest of doing more OSINT, up in the nest, the very first thing that you'll see there is a post that's actually a reply to Schizo's thread from our friend Teddy, who is looking for information about what something that appears to be in the water is. And if you have any suggestions or information about that, I would encourage you to reply to that.
Okay, thanks for that. Go ahead, Radio and Nukes.
I just wanted to add a quick comment to what you had said. Some of the last nuclear tests that took place were actually calibration tests. So we invited a Soviet team to the Nevada desert, and a U.S. team went to Semipalatinsk, and they both set off underground explosions for the sole point and purpose of calibrating seismic and infrasound sensors. So what you had said about the dam is there's history, and it's been done before, different circumstances, but it makes perfect sense. I just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to see whether, I presume they would understand based on the geology between the detonation point and the monitoring station, probably how large a set of explosives they would need. But I wonder if they had way too much or way too little, whether it could still be used sort of to calibrate, and the only difference is amplitude. I don't know. But that's probably why I put their report up. So I'll read through that and hopefully I'll learn a little bit more. It was Brad and then Aaron. Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, so a few of us have gone back and forth in the various discussions around, was it a detonation? Was it a collapse? And I know we're not super focused on that, but actually determining that it wasn't, if it was not a detonation, definitively determining that is actually very, very important from the standpoint of war doctrine. So Portland and I were having an offline conversation going back and forth on this issue. I'm going to read two very brief comments from that conversation to basically explain what I'm talking about. So this is me. The main thing I got to in my post is that, contrary to popular belief, the underlying root cause matters, because if they blew it, then for all intents and purposes, a metaphorical red button has already been pushed. The WMD Rubicon has been crossed, a new precedent set, and another such use becomes more likely. Portland's response to this was, A detonation is important because certain powers, most notably the UK, regard all uses of WMD as functionally equivalent to a nuke. And if British interests are threatened, including any threat to the supremacy of the nuclear taboo, it is British policy to respond with nuclear weapons. So basically, what it all boils down to is that, depending upon the different, war doctrines involved of the different countries in the area, if it were determined that the collapse of the dam was intentional, and obviously that'd be easier to determine if you can prove a detonation, then that would constitute the use of a WMD. Depending upon, the war doctrines of the different parties involved and countries in the area, the use of a WMD could necessitate a specific response, right? And if Russia knows what that specific response is, then essentially, if a WMD, if it was a detonation and therefore it gets classified as a WMD necessitating a response, then Russia is more likely to proactively strike to prevent that response. Do you see what I'm saying? So ruling out a detonation is actually quite important here, to the extent that it wasn't a detonation. If it was a detonation, then, that's another can of worms. And I'm not saying that, even if it was a detonation that we're going to end up in a nuclear conflict, but you see how, interacting military doctrines of first strike or preemptive strike type stuff puts us on really, really precarious soil, almost silt, if you will, in this type of a situation.
I see what you did there. We'll go to Aaron and then David. Go ahead, Aaron.
Sorry about that. So one thing that I saw in some channels was that the Russians ordered...
Aaron, sorry, I don't know if it's just me. You're coming in very quietly. I don't know if you have maybe headphones on or something.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah, yes, that's better. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. One report I heard, and hasn't been confirmed.
I'm sorry. I don't think I'm the only one. I think, Aaron, you're breaking up. We'll definitely come back around to you once you reconnect. For the time being, we'll go to David and then Museum. Go ahead, David.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, yeah, I got to call out somebody. The Russians look at WMDs completely different than we do. The Soviets did. Not local commanders, but regional commanders had the authority in the Cold War to use tactical nuclear weapons. The same thing with chemical weapons, but not biological weapons. And they don't look at this as a WMD, and they just blew up another dam 2 weeks ago. So they blew up a dam more towards Donetsk to flood the area, to try and make sure that Ukrainians didn't use that area for the offensive. They did it way too soon, and nobody said anything. So if they blow up a dam, I think it's like 50 kilometers east of there, nobody said anything about it. It's like, so it blew up a dam. And so why wouldn't they blow up another dam? Not thinking it's going to go all at once, but, trying to do a limited demolition, and it backfired because nobody said anything about the first dam.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think that motive does tend to lean toward the Russians. It's just that because it's hard to come to a conclusion based on motive alone, I'm trying to focus on what evidence there is, and unfortunately, there just isn't a lot yet.
I agree. Yeah. I thoroughly agree. I only deal with the tactical. You see my stuff that I write. I only try to deal with the tactical stuff. But as far as a WMD is concerned, they look at WMDs completely different than the West does. And so a regional commander would probably have the authority to damage the dam. I don't think they meant to blow it like that. And it doesn't matter if they blew it or if it went because of maintenance. It was under their watch. And that's all I'm going to say.
Yep, I think we're on the same page. So it was museum, and then we'll see if there's anybody else. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Additional point to what I was going to talk about, but on the question of the bridge, the dam being blown up accidentally, I personally don't see that. Certainly within NATO, a significant demolition is covered by very strict rules and absolutely clear orders. It's not something that you could misunderstand. So I would expect the Russians to be the same. But on the point of evidence of explosions, I think our best hope is that, as Gurney described, that somebody has calibrated or identified a particular signature for significant explosions and that's been detected. Although I would say in my mind, at least there's a question as to whether if you were a seismologist or a geotechnical scientist and knowing that this was a possibility, whether by using a series of smaller explosions you could be below the threshold of discrimination. And I think that may be possible. I also rather suspect that the Russians have used undermining of the support as a primary means of causing failure rather than blowing it apart. Certainly what I've seen of the turbine hall damage really does not suggest to me that there was an explosion in the turbine hall, as was suggested, I think, by the Ukrainian government initially, although that may have been a mistranslation, because there's windows intact and you don't get that if there's an explosion of any size nearby. And also just from the pattern of settling and what I can see of the broken edges between the parts, just suggests to me this is a building that's lost its support and separated. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. With regard to smaller explosions, I'll also note that this theory that there may have been structural weaknesses. So even if there were an explosion, perhaps it was all that was required was a much smaller detonation than if it had been completely structurally sound. But that's speculation. I'll also note, just to toss into the conversation, I'm not suggesting that this would be detected by a seismograph, but there are also some videos out there of some explosions near the breach in the dam that occurred after the dam had been breached. You probably have in mind the same video that I saw, in which some seem to think it may be a rocket or RPG that was fired at the dam after the breach for some reason. That's not been explained. The theory I saw, this one was put out, I think, by DEFMON, was that maybe there were attempts to get video from a certain angle to make it look like it was blown up. But my point being that if they were detonating things in and around the time that the collapse occurred, is it possible that maybe the seismological record might be complicated by more than one blast? I'm just throwing that out there. So I'm going to go back to museum to follow up, and then we'll go to Aaron, who unfortunately we lost a moment ago. Go ahead, museum.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Certainly, if you were aware of weaknesses, you'd want to exploit them. My guess is that as far as possible, they've tried to use the force of the water as the primary means of destroying the dam, even if it wasn't the initiating of the action. And I also think we've got a real problem in terms of physical evidence, because the sheer volume and speed of the water is going to have washed everything away. We're going to be extremely lucky, I think, to find any physical evidence there. Yeah.
Sorry, trouble with the mic. Yep, absolutely. So we'll go to Aaron. Sorry for losing you earlier. Go ahead.
That's all right. Happens all the time. Can you hear me now okay, or we've still got a bad connection?
Nope, you're coming through fine. Go ahead.
So some reports were that the Russians sorry?
Sorry, we lost you for maybe 3 seconds there, so it may be patchy, but I can hear you now, so just keep going.
Yeah, so the heavy equipment had been moved from the south bank, or the tanks and infantry. So that sort of implies that the Russians knew about it beforehand. And the other thing was, I heard on another site, was that this is going to have real impacts for Bulgaria and Turkey coming into summer. Those beaches are going to be heavily polluted with viruses and pathogens, and people are going to get sick and die. So it affects 2 or 3 NATO countries on the Black Sea coast. That's going to come out further down the track. So that may have ramifications if evidence comes out. That's all. Thanks.
Sure, thanks for that. I hadn't seen the evidence that they had moved the heavy equipment away, but if that's the case, I'll be interested to see it. So if you happen to have coverage of that, please DM it to me or add it to the nest. Just as an admin note, we have 2 or 3 additional people requesting. We're just trying to make space on the speakers panel. So if you've spoken and you're happy to cycle down, then we'll bring a few more people up. Thanks for that. We'll go to Brad. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, in the absence of evidence of a detonation, the term that I am using to describe what Russia has done here, and I think it's a pretty decent one, is stochastic negligence. In other words, you can't necessarily prove that they did it, but they were certainly responsible for it, and they created the conditions, the right conditions under which something happened. It's kind of the equivalent of, okay, they didn't shoot you in the head. What they did was they blindfolded you, and they put you on a narrow ledge of a cliff just because it was fun, right? So that's how I'm how I'm referring to this thing. Stochastic, kind of like the term stochastic terrorism. Most of you probably do, but it's stochastic is a term from calculus. It refers to the insertion of a random variable, right? So stochastic negligence. I'm out.
Okay. We'll go, apologies if I got the order wrong. I think it was Schizo and then Gurney. Go ahead, Schizo.
Yeah, so something like the problem I've been having with the seismology data is where in that graph does it actually show the explosion? So they came, the people who published it, the Norwegian organization that published that chart, they initially said like something happened, and there's very faint evidence in the graph to show an explosion, and then later today they changed it and said actually it does show an explosion, but they haven't highlighted where in the graph, and they don't actually indicate, like when they say explosion, does it just mean the dam collapsing? Because a structure collapsing, I think that could be viewed in terms of what you're going to pick up on a seismograph as a, quote, explosion. And also the witness reports, like I've gotten a lot of flack from people on Twitter the last few days to be like, oh, but the locals said there was an explosion. And it's like, I've read through the postings and it doesn't seem consistent with what you would describe as like a bomb going off or something. The description of what we have is the biggest one that's being shared around is a incomprehensible noise followed by the sudden rush of water and a white flash. The white flash is the electrical wires, the transformers, generators, electrical equipment making contact with the water. Okay, the rush of water, that seems pretty evident. The water from the dam rushing downriver. So then it just comes down to, what is the incomprehensible noise? Is it a bomb or is it the dam itself just completely collapsing? And I've highlighted a lot of people have just completely disregarded the environmental report that I posted a few days ago. In 2019, the Ukrainian government was looking at expanding the turbine hall. It was supposed to be like turbine hall 2. And in their environmental impact assessment, when they were doing the geology and just talking about like what's the environmental impacts of building more infrastructure to the dam, they specifically highlight that the left bank where the turbine hall is located is not suitable for construction due to the soil underneath, which is just very fine sand. They recommended not to proceed with construction of the second turbine hall, and the project was quickly abandoned thereafter. That's pretty telling, because the section of the dam that collapsed is the section of the dam that is resting upon 40 meters of fine sediment, fine grainy sand. And you can see this in the side view graphs of the dam, the turbine hall, and the boiler room. In those really old sketches of cross view of those sections of the plant, they specifically note, like here's the dam, here's the boiler room, here's the concrete slab, here's the foundation, and what's directly underneath it, just fine sand. It's not very good foundationally. And then you add the fact of the Ukrainian government has acknowledged that the 205th Motorized Rifle, I can't remember if it's battalion or regiment, that has been in the vicinity of the dam. They acknowledge that they have not done anything at this dam since November. All 6 turbines have been offline. No electricity has been produced since November. And they acknowledge that they've done nothing to regulate or do any work at the dam in terms of water level management. We still don't have a full picture of what the remote access that the civilian staff would have had at the dam. They've not been present. So the picture is nobody's been operating this dam, and the only real oversight of this has been whatever access the civilian staff had via remote access on some computers or security cameras at the facility. The gates weren't open, nothing was done to mitigate the water levels. And with the overtopping, you can look at the satellite imagery. That's been happening since mid-April, mid to late April till the collapse. And this dam construction is a earth-filled dam. Those don't hold up to overtopping at all. It's a severe weakness to this style of dam that's constructed. And with the overtopping, it can erode, but it's known as scouring, underlying foundation. You see this a lot in dams that collapse every year.
So, Schizo, you've done a great job looking at this in detail, and I put up your thread as one of the great examples of the structural collapse argument. And so just when we get into, access to the turbine hall and all of that, I understand that it's circumstantial. I'm just trying not to relitigate it because I know it's been gone over in spaces several times. And apologies. The only reason I'm jumping in is I don't have quite as much time as I normally do tonight. So I'm going to have to wrap in about 10 minutes. So I'm hoping to work through the available hands, and then maybe I'll get a couple lightning points in to kind of close out the dam topic. Before I go to those hands, I'll note that if you go to the first item in the nest, just to get it in early, our next conversation will be Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern time. And we're hoping, we always are approaching guests, so we're hoping it'll either be something about economics or something about nuclear energy in Ukraine. And we'll see which gets there first. So please come and join us. Set your reminder now. I think the order was Gurney, Aaron, and then Angry Ants. Go ahead, Gurney.
Thanks, Michael. This is just a direct response. You had mentioned a while back in terms of the seismograph data, possible confounding variable or different things that there was. It was reported there were videos of explosions afterwards, and I just wanted to clarify on this. It looks like, and there's not, again, the thing about this is, right, there's some evidence, but there's a lack of conclusive evidence. But I just wanted to say in response to that, it's been alleged that a lot of those videos in daylight the water flow had displaced mines that were in the reservoir at different points in the reservoir, and as those mines were swept towards the dam, that they exploded. I think one of those videos in particular may have been doctored to look like there was an incoming missile, when it was in fact just a mine going through that pass. But I just wanted to respond to that directly because it'll be hard with all that seismograph data and the flow of the water itself, and those mines to really see what discrete variables are talking about in the data. So that's why I'm looking forward to seeing what they put out with the seismograph data in their analysis. I'd also be curious just to see, how they differentiate the water flow from the seismograph. Again, it's one of these tough situations where there's plenty of evidence, but there's seems to be a lack of conclusive evidence. Thanks.
I agree with you. You raised some great points that we didn't touch on. So go ahead, Aaron.
How you doing, guys? Sorry, I wanted to come in earlier. It's been a busy day working on the museum and stuff. So everything that Portland had stated last night in the Bauma report and everything that he's been saying points to me, and what everybody else has figured out too, is there's no blast. Doesn't look like there's blast damage onto this dam. So it leads me into thinking, that this is definitely, what does they call it? Just scholastic negligence, or what was the term that Brad used?
Stochastic.
Stochastic. Thank you. And that's it. Just they weren't monitoring the water levels. They weren't, and I think that the overstrain finally just gave way. It just looks like it's still the Russians' fault. It's the reason why this dam collapsed is because of Russian negligence. Let's not forget that. I think that this is it's unfortunate once again, and I think we're going to find out more as days go on. Another thing that's concerning is the water levels, from water levels around the pool to the ZNPP, the nuclear power plant. They're receding, so there's worry about that pool as well, and about its access to maintain the water for the cooling. And that's another thing that has been a little bit of a concern, but I don't think a massive concern, because I think that those are supposed to be shut down. But on other news, there's just skimming over some stuff, but there was more missile launches tonight supposedly. I'm not sure what was shot down yet. There was at least 4 MiG-31Ks with possible Kinzhal ballistic missiles that could have been fired. We don't know. Soon, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense will come out with figures here probably in the next few hours as far as what was shot down today, because there was air raids all over Ukraine. We'll have some more figures here quite shortly. Hope everybody can join me for the Bauma report Sunday night at 2300 my time. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. The reservoir by the plant is a great point. Hopefully we'll get to it in just a moment. There was some concern that as the water level in the main reservoir lowers, it offers less counter pressure to the retaining wall separating out that cooling pond water, and that may cause problems, but we'll find out. Angry Ants, go ahead.
Well, since I'm the last hand here, I just wanted to kind of thank you again for having the space and everyone participating. It's always great to have these things. And I actually had to put my phone down. It was cool to have the show on YouTube. So I recommend everybody doing that also. These spaces are vital for giving folks the information that they really need to know about what's going on. We need to get more of that out there. Why I came back up really was I saw David D up here, and I started messaging him from this Angry Ants account right when I first made it up early on, talking about mechanized brigades and divisions and how we actually had a lot of stuff getting there. And first time getting up there on the space with him, so I just want to give him a shout out. Great work as always, and it's been cool to watch some of the things come to fruition that we talked about way back in January and February. So anyway, great talk tonight, guys.
Thanks for that. And always appreciate your input. And hopefully we can keep the same crowd coming out because we get some great conversations going. So maybe we have maybe 5 minutes left. So sort of by way of lightning round, the folks who help us out with YouTube always love when I say lightning round because I go through the references so fast they can't keep up bringing them up on screen, or so I've been told. Just to cover the remaining content for the dam, I'm just going to call these out as, like, I put them up as all the topics together and then I break them out individually in the nest most of the time. But starting from the first item on the left in the nest, there have been various calls for investigations into the cause of the dam collapse. And I understand that on Twitter, a bunch of people want to say, well, of course, it's the Russians' fault. But, to assign responsibility in a court, there will have to be investigations. And I note that, first of all, Turkey called for a commission to be created. So there's a tweet to that effect. And then also, if you look at the tweet from Zelensky about his conversation with French President Macron, toward the bottom, he does talk about the possibility of using an international mechanism to investigate the cause of the dam collapse. So it seems like Zelensky is open to it. I also wanted to point out the possibility of war crimes charges, and you'll see there are two tweets there, the first of which is from Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov, talking about Article 56, Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions about, large-scale civil infrastructure. There's also a tweet from the account of Lottie Leicht, who was a international prosecutor, talking about some other things where charges could potentially be pressed for
Mr.
damage to. Yes.
Hi, you need to reset. So yeah, Lottie Leicht was talking about charges. I don't know if that's the one I actually read that I'm thinking of now. Oh, yes, it is. We were having an interesting conversation about this actually in the background, that it really matters exactly what happened here because it could impact the charging standards that happen when they go to prosecute for this particular crime. And so getting some real definition and evidence about exactly what happened and how it happened is really important for an eventual trial on this particular portion of the war. Mr. Bond?
Thanks very much for covering for me. Sorry, I have to reset every so often. So those were the points on investigation and on potential war crimes. You'll also note that there's reference to the use of the Moscow mechanism, potentially to investigate environmental damage. So I'll let you investigate that if you're interested. The second item in the nest is talking about some of the environmental damages, including the loss of crops, estimating the degree of crop loss. There's a quick survey looking at whether environmental NGOs said anything about the destruction of the dam in the first day or so after it occurred. The implication being that they weren't really paying attention to what's happening in Ukraine as they should, you would want them to be. I thought that was an interesting survey. And then a note in the Kiev Independent with Ukrainian officials noting that exports from the Dnipro will be extremely difficult. I presume not only because of the risk of things like floating mines, but also the changing navigable waterways, right? They won't know where the silt has been deposited, which is something you might not think of at first glance. I thought, sorry, people have moved things around on me. So the fourth item back in the nest, there's a tweet that starts with the word canals. You may have seen this one. There are 4 major canals that are fed from the reservoir behind the dam. Apparently they're at risk. However, apparently not all of those canals are completely gravity fed. So you can see there's a map put together by Russian Bridges Go Boom, a friend of our space, about the locations of the various canal pumping stations. Apparently Russia had also been pumping water through the Crimean Canal quite heavily for the last few months, filling up reservoirs in Crimea. So even though the water supply has been cut, his estimation, is that they'll have water supply in Crimea for about 2 years. And then finally, in that same tweet on canals, there's an interesting graphic in a thread by Chris O, looking at the rate of loss of vegetation in Crimea when water was cut following the 2014 seizure of Crimea by the Russians. And you can see that in just a few years, the rate of vegetation dropped, markedly. I think, is there one more? There is one more. In other consequences that flow from this, there's under the tweet in the nest, I believe it's the 5th back that starts with the word disease. There's concern that this will cause lots of intestinal disease, waterborne disease, as the reliability of the water supply, goes down in the area. And interestingly, it affects not just the immediate area around the river, but there's a tweet there about how Mykolaiv, which is more than 100 kilometers away, is also affected because it gets its drinking water from the river via pipeline, which was a situation that developed after Russia destroyed the original water supplies, and they had to put in a temporary pipeline to supply water to Mykolaiv. So, other areas in the region are similarly affected. However, the Ministry of Infrastructure did come out and say they would be building some new water mains. So that's good news. Also, the effect on the electrical system I thought was important. It was noted in a tweet from Dionys Sensua that, I'll see, what was his source? It was Ukrinform. An article in Ukrinform that apparently 129 substations were submerged in the flooding. However, in the Kiev Independent, Ukrenergo, which is the Ukrainian electricity operator, came out and said that the stability of the grid is still good and should not be affected by this. Finally, there's a tweet in that same thread with the title of disease, about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It's a tweet by Mark Nelson, who does great work on covering the plant and nuclear power, that while the plant itself is fairly stable, apparently 5 of the 6 reactors are cold shutdown and 1 is sort of hot shutdown just to generate some electricity to keep some systems running. He does note the risk to the cooling pond reservoir with the back pressure from the broader reservoir decreasing as the water level there decreases. So he's keeping an eye on that, and we are hoping we might be able to get Mark to come in and chat with us at some point in the next week or two, because I suspect that the Zaporizhzhia plant will become increasingly important as the offensive continues into that region. So I think with that, I'm going to call it. Apologies that I have to wrap up a few minutes early. But we will try and make up for it perhaps on Sunday by making sure we cover more. So please do join us on Sunday. The invite to that space is in the nest. I'll move it up to the front again so that you can set your reminders. And that will be Sunday at 4 o'clock. So with that, thank you very much to everybody who came to listen tonight. I'd like to thank all the speakers. Just about all of the speakers are people I know have been following this in detail for a very long time. I would encourage you to check out their profiles and consider giving them a follow, particularly since Twitter seems now to be doing sort of a search suppression, search ban on pro-Ukraine accounts. I think it's maybe more important than ever to build connections so that we can follow one another's work. And I'd like to thank my co-hosts, Exit and Radio and Nukes. Without your guys' support, it would be extremely hard to run these spaces. And so with that, hopefully I'll see you Sunday, and have a great night.